In this presentation, I will discuss why narcissistic abuse is so prevalent in America and how mainstream parenting tactics are connected to authoritarian governments and the recent rise of fascism in the United States. When children grow up learning that love must be earned, that questioning power is dangerous, and that survival means silence, they become adults primed to obey, to fear difference, and to mistake domination for leadership. If we want a different future, it starts with how we treat the smallest and most powerless among us. We could completely change the world in a single generation by raising children who know what safety feels like without having to earn it. Most of us think that abuse is obvious. We imagine bruises, yelling, screaming, violence. But the most dangerous kind of abuse doesn't leave a single mark. Coercive control is a pattern of domination, isolation, and manipulation designed to make someone doubt their reality and surrender their autonomy without even realizing it. But here's an uncomfortable truth. Most of us grew up learning coercive control, not because our parents were evil, but because power over dynamics are how our society teaches relationship. This slide discusses how power over dynamics are normalized through modern American parenting practices. In 2023, I wrote a paper, and in 2024 created a presentation, both called Western Parenting Impacts on Human Development and Behavior, America's Hidden Health Crisis, which explored in detail the profound impact that these 5 common power strategies have on human development and behavior. As children, we were born into a hierarchy where adults maintain ownership over us and expect us to meet their needs. Respect is demanded without being returned, and we were taught that love means obedience, respect means making ourselves smaller, that adults are always right, and children are too sensitive if they speak up. We were told to hug people we didn't feel safe with, to stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about, to ignore our instincts in order to keep the peace. That's not love, it's conditioning. So when we grow up, we typically get into one-sided relationships that mirror this dynamic. We can start by naming the tactics of narcissistic abuse, the subtle, everyday coercive control that hides in plain sight. Narcissistic abuse is about domination and involves power over dynamics such as legitimacy, where one person feels entitled to control or manipulate the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and perceptions of another. It looks like gaslighting, where your reality is constantly denied. Love bombing, excessive praise to hook you early, then replaced with withdrawal. Silent treatment, blame shifting, triangulation, all used to destabilize and control. Abuse is not always physical, it's emotional, psychological, and strategic, and it works by making the target believe they are the problem. Over time, this type of abuse breaks you down from the inside. It causes chronic self-doubt, anxiety, and complex PTSD. The problem is no one has been taught to recognize it because these tactics have all been normalized in childhood. Instead, the psychological abuse manifests as physical symptoms, such as chronic pain, immune disorders, digestive issues, or cognitive and emotional issues. Survivors slowly lose their sense of self and struggle to trust others, often without even knowing what is happening or why. Many feel ashamed for not leaving sooner, when the truth is this has been normalized in our culture, and these tactics are designed to make escape feel impossible. What's worse is that to outsiders, the abuser looks charming. They often don't see the abuse as abusive because they do the same things themselves. So the survivor is left not only questioning their worth, but also reality itself. And many adults pass coercive control on without realizing it through how they treat children in power over dynamics. Here's the part that gets uncomfortable. A majority of the tactics listed in narcissistic abuse are also widely normalized in mainstream Western parenting practices. which typically relies on authoritarian or punitive styles of relating to children. These coercive tactics are often disguised as discipline, good parenting, or teaching respect. Telling a child, "Stop crying, you're fine," is gaslighting. Withholding affection when they misbehave, that's love withdrawal. Using phrases like, "You made me angry," that's blame shifting. Children are told, "You're being disrespectful" for expressing themselves. "Go to your room until you can be pleasant" is emotional exile. "Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about" is threat-based compliance. "You'll do what I say because I'm the parent" is enforced obedience over connection. In our culture, these are often labeled good discipline, but they don't teach self-regulation. They teach fear, shame, and obedience. They break trust in the child's own body and instincts, priming them for future abuse. This isn't tough love, it's emotional manipulation. When children grow up under narcissistic control, the impact is profound. They may develop anxious or avoidant attachment, struggle with identity, and become hyper-attuned to others' needs while ignoring their own, otherwise known as codependent. They often grow into adults who either become controlling or find themselves drawn to people who are. The legacy of narcissistic abuse doesn't just end with one person, it gets passed down, normalized, and mistaken for love, unless we name it, interrupt it, and choose something different. But here's the good news. Coercive control can be unlearned. We can recognize the patterns. We can name what we were never allowed to name. And we can build something different. Love is not control. Respect is not fear. And healing begins when we realize we are not too sensitive. We were too controlled. The Duluth model was created in the early 1980s in Duluth, Minnesota, because patterns emerged across many cases of domestic violence which pointed to power and control as the core issue rather than mental illness, substance abuse, or anger. The research behind the Duluth model found that most abusers in intimate partner violence used a consistent set of tactics designed to dominate, isolate, and control their partners. These tactics were not random, they were systematic and intentional, often hidden beneath seemingly normal behaviors. Abusers often minimized, denied, or blamed others for their actions, fitting a single profile of predictable patterns. The power and control wheel shows that most abusive dynamics follows the same power-based behavioral structure across many relationships, regardless of individual differences. But it didn't connect these behaviors to how they were conditioned and learned in childhood through modern parenting practices. And it also didn't address how these predictable patterns of behavior are embedded into America's governing institutions, laws, and policies. The prevalence of punitive discipline, both globally and in Western culture, is not just a social norm, it's systemic coercive control that has been normalized and rebranded as governance and as parenting. And when you overlay this with the Duluth model's findings about patterns of adult abuse, it becomes undeniable. The very tactics that we criminalize in individual adult relationships are also widely practiced, defended, and even celebrated in family systems and in institutions. Coercive control has been so normalized in childhood that we often fail to recognize it as abuse in adulthood, and when we do, we label it abuse instead of seeing it for what it really is: culturally conditioned behaviors that are learned and institutionally sanctioned. The Duluth model didn't just identify abusers, it unknowingly described normalized parenting behaviors through the lens of power and control. This is generational conditioning and results in the governance that we experience today. And this is what is responsible for the increasing prevalence of narcissistic abuse. Children raised under coercive systems either replicate abusive behaviors or become vulnerable to them in adulthood, sometimes both. Coercive control begins in the family. In the family, children are taught to submit to authority using tactics we would call abuse if used on adults. Governments replicate this dynamic, institutionalizing control through law, punishment, and surveillance. The child raised in coercion becomes the adult who either repeats it or is vulnerable to it, perpetuating the system unless it's interrupted by trauma-informed awareness and relational repair. Let's take a look at how power operates, not just in government, but in families and everyday relationships. On the left, we see a family tree. This represents more than biology, it's the earliest institution we're part of. It's where we first learn who has power, who obeys, and what happens when we question authority. For many children, this hierarchy is rigid. Adults have control, children are expected to comply. If love is conditional and discipline is punitive, children grow up learning that control is a form of love and that obedience is safety. On the right, we have branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, designed to check each other's power. But when families raise children in top-down systems of control, that same structure gets mirrored here. Each branch can become a tool of coercion rather than protection, just like a parent who says, "Because I said so," instead of inviting a back and forth dialogue. And above, we see two spectrums of government control, going from anarchy to tyranny. What's striking is that in the pyramids above, it shows how family is literally the foundation of how power gets distributed. In systems that value autonomy and interdependence, power rises up from the people through individuals, families, and communities. But in systems that normalize coercion, control flows downward from the top, through the family, and into the child's body, belief, and behaviors. When coercive control is taught as parenting, we train citizens to either submit to domination or replicate it themselves. These patterns are responsible for the hidden health crisis of narcissism, as well as the resultant PTSD that is affecting women and children in epidemic proportions and which remains unaddressed. When we talk about PTSD, most people think of war veterans, but looking closer at the data, we can break down where trauma is actually happening in the United States annually. About 100,000 veterans develop PTSD each year. Other cohorts affected by PTSD also include 1.5 million women, mostly domestic abuse survivors, 4.5 million children, primarily exposed to violence at home. That's 60 times more children and 15 times more women developing PTSD each year than veterans. But who gets the treatment programs? Who is getting the public recognition? Who gets media portrayals, funding, and policy responses? This isn't just a data issue, it's a visibility issue. We've built systems that center the trauma at war while ignoring the war at home. Let's talk about total prevalence and how many people are living with PTSD today. Veterans make up only 3%. Women who survived abuse make up 39%, while children exposed to violence make up 58%. The majority of people living with PTSD in this country are not soldiers. They are women and children who are being traumatized by people they trust in places they are supposed to feel safe. This tells us something urgent and disturbing. Our collective understanding of trauma is deeply shaped by who we allow to speak and who we silence, who we listen to, and who we ignore. When coercive control is normalized in childhood, the trauma it causes becomes invisible, not because it isn't real, but because it is socially sanctioned. What we're exploring here isn't just a personal crisis, it's a political one. Fascism doesn't begin with flags, slogans, or rallies. It begins in childhood, when fear replaces trust and obedience replaces autonomy. It begins when abuse is renamed discipline and domination is mistaken for order. To resist fascism, we have to do more than vote. We have to raise children differently. We have to relearn safety, power, and care. And we have to interrupt the cycle of control at home, in schools, and ourselves. Because authoritarianism doesn't just knock on the door, we hand it the keys when we teach children to stay silent and obey. Have you ever noticed how the happiest countries in the world have a strong commitment to protecting nature, the social safety net, and education? Max Weber described bureaucracy as the dominant form of social organization in Western society, structured through hierarchy, strict rules, and impersonal procedures. At first glance, bureaucracy looks efficient, but when you examine its psychological impact, it begins to mirror something darker: coercive control. Just like in an abusive relationship, bureaucratic systems use gaslighting by denying people's lived experiences with phrases like "it's just policy" or "that's the rule." Impose emotional withdrawal, cutting off access to aid or support when someone is deemed non-compliant. Enforce surveillance through audits, check-ins, case files, and control over personal data. And manipulate people using incentives and punishments, not unlike how abusers alternate between affection and fear to maintain dominance. Weber warned about the iron cage of rationality, which is a system so obsessed with order and efficiency that it strips away individuality, emotion, and human judgment. This isn't just red tape, it's relational trauma scaled to society. Bureaucracy becomes abusive when it no longer serves people, but forces people to serve it. So when survivors say they felt re-traumatized by courts, child welfare, or the healthcare system, this is why. It's not a flaw in the system, it is the system. And unless we redefine authority around relational attunement rather than coercive control, we will keep rebuilding abusive systems from government to family structure, no matter how noble our intention. This presentation has exposed a malignant cancer that is quickly killing America. The truth is that coercive control begins in families, gets mirrored by our institutions, and leaves millions of women and children living with unrecognized PTSD. If trauma can be passed down, healing can too. Every time we choose regulation over repression, connection over control, truth over silence, we reclaim power in its healthiest form, shared and not imposed. Freedom begins with awareness. Reclaim our story, reclaim our voice, and reclaim freedom. In Sweden, spanking dropped from 90% in the 1960s to under 10% by 2010 after legal reform and public education. The United States can redesign parenting, education, and governance to center safety, dignity, and emotional intelligence, and will achieve the same results. This is how we can truly and genuinely make America great again. Better is possible. Better starts by taking your power back. We do this by recognizing, resisting, and healing from coercive control. Thank you for listening to my presentation.